An elected official with the Métis Nation Saskatchewan was caught on tape leaving a series of profanity-laced voicemails. APTN National News obtained the recordings from the sister of the man, who she says left them on her phone. Our panelists, Jennifer Laewetz of Paskwâw Strategies and Niigaan Sinclair with the Winnipeg Free Press, are here to discuss this. But first, take a listen to one of those voicemails.
Don't come to any more local meetings. You're not welcome there. You make me want to puke, you dirty rotten. You scatterbrained.
Jennifer, Niigaan, thank you both for joining us. So Jennifer, your turn to start us off this week. These voicemail recordings are still going around on social media. Do you think this is an isolated thing between bad blood between a Métis brother and sister, or is there more to it than that?
I'm not really sure. You know, it's no surprise to anybody that I've had my own grievances with the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. I'm actually one of the several people that is barred indefinitely from ever attending their governance meetings in person for criticizing their government. But I, as a political commentator, there is a lot of information that is shared with me, and part of my role as a commentator is to sift through all of the information I get. I want to say that this is the first time I'm hearing about this individual, but unfortunately it's not. So whether or not it's isolated is still up in the air, but what I can say is that I have heard the recordings. I am concerned, and I don't think that this is an isolated issue with the Métis Nation Saskatchewan having problems internally. I think it's just part of a much larger problem that's currently existing within that government.
And what were your thoughts when you first heard the comments, Niigaan?
Well, politics have certainly turned rancorous over the past few years. We have the U.S. president openly giving the middle finger to citizens who that he's purporting to represent. We have an ongoing issue, I think, with the issue of civility in politics. There is a long-standing history of politicians who have sort of been deemed as above the fray, above the kind of violence or mean-spiritedness that often takes place in politics, especially when they're elected to office. In this case, you certainly see what happens behind the closed doors, behind the ways politics, when the cameras aren't always on, what it looks like. And of course, politicians are humans too, but they need to act with a higher standard. Certainly, traditional leadership would have dealt with something very swiftly like this. You would not use inappropriate language with members of your lodge or of your clan, of your tradition. So it's really not acceptable to be able to, do these in organizations. And I say organizations very openly because we're not really talking so much about governments. Oftentimes, governments are things that are accountable to people like the media. They don't get to ban and pick and choose who they get to deal with. And so the idea of banning Jen at meetings is just indicative that we're not really dealing with a government here, we're dealing with an organization.
And in your experience as an observer of Indigenous politics, Jennifer, what do these recordings say about the level of politics going on with the Métis Nation Saskatchewan as a whole, and what impact it has for other Métis groups across Canada?
Well, I think this is showing us that there's a certain level of, instability within the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. I think, exactly what Niigaan said. If you want to be a government, then you need to start acting like a government. And that also goes for the way that your citizens and your people are going to hold you accountable. And what is really interesting is that it almost expands beyond just Métis people as well, because as we know, the federal government does send a considerable amount of money over to the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. So there's also that piece of who are they all accountable to? Are they also accountable to the federal government and also to people outside of them, including taxpayers of this country? But I think we're seeing, a much larger issue here. And, part of the reason when they banned us is saying, we really want our spaces to be respectful and peaceful and positive and all these wonderful things. But I can say that I've never talked to somebody like that. You're not going to find voicemails or recordings of me ever speaking to somebody like that. But I'm not allowed in those spaces. But rather, I get to now see a man that has talked to somebody that way, including his own family, which in Métis and First Nations politics, a lot of us are all related. So that excuse doesn't really get to fly when at any point you could start using the excuse, oh, it's just a family thing. And it's just really frustrating now that, I'm prevented from ever going into those spaces with my Métis grandmother or my kids because they've, picked apart reasons saying, we just want this to be an inclusive and respectful space. But they themselves are exhibiting behavior that is not that. So.
Niigaan, since the voicemails have gone public, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan has removed the elected official from his portfolio and chair positions. What do you think of the MNS's response, and what else do you think could be done to address this?
Well, it's certainly more than what you often see these days with provincial governments or even with federal governments. Oftentimes, one only has to turn to the House of Commons on question period to see the amount of rancor language, inappropriate language that's used, often sexist, sometimes racist language that's used. And so what do I think about it? I think that there is a duty to act responsibly and ethically in relation to your citizens. I think that it's also important that there's a level of standard in leadership, in Indigenous leadership in particular, which should be at its highest form. Really, it is very true. Us in the media, if we even were caught swearing to each other, to a politician, you wouldn't have your job for very long. You would be quickly removed. And so for a politician to be held responsible and accountable, I mean, that's what it should be in the first place.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to leave it there, but we're going to look at the way U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement squads are arresting Native Americans south of the Medicine Line over on the podcast. Thanks to you both. So Niigaan, what's your take on the arrests of a small number of homeless Oglala Sioux members from an encampment in Minneapolis by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents?
Well, ICE and President Donald Trump has declared war on Minneapolis in particular. And of course, we know that Minneapolis is the birthplace of the American Indian movement. It's also the birthplace of much violence and recent violence in the murder of George Floyd against African Americans. And so the issue of race in Minneapolis is very cognizant. It's very much in your face. And Indigenous peoples sleeping outside, suffering from poverty, from marginalization, from a long-standing land theft by the American government on First Nations, Indigenous peoples in the United States. I mean, you see it right there on the ground in Minneapolis. And what I see is ICE treating Indigenous peoples as though they're not Americans. And what the attacks on birthright citizenship by the Trump administration has really underlined that Native Americans are continue to be mistreated and treated as the most marginalized people within North America, even more so than immigrants, because they are people who are literally born there and predate the American state. But now, because of their legal relationship through treaties, through sovereignty with the U.S. states and the federal government, now they're deemed as lesser than Americans, not even Americans, even though they are the true Americans. It's really absurd.
And Jennifer, this is not an isolated incident either. Enrolled members of Native American tribes, known as Treaty Indians up here, are being scooped up all over the U.S., albeit in smaller numbers. But what does that tell us about ICE?
Ooh, I've been talking a lot about this on social media lately, just even about like government and when it comes to authority and the force that is used by governments. And I think, there's been a lot of ramping up of political division, especially from the Trump administration in recent months. And it's been happening for years now. But I'm noticing that there's been a really, really big increase in the scale of almost an effort to desensitize the public. Some of the things that they're coming out and saying are not things we would typically hear from diplomatic politicians, especially in the media, especially, we saw J.D. Vance come out on media right after the shooting of that woman down in the United States last week, and immediately took the position of defending ICE, saying they have full authority and, they're immune from like being criticized in this type of instance. But on the other side, we live in democracies in Canada and the United States. And part of our role as citizens in our social contract is to make sure that we are holding governments accountable, but also the force that comes from their agencies, whether it be up here, RCMP or CBSA, all of those different types of things. We cannot run to the side of saying, yep, force is to be used first and ask questions later. When civilians are dying at the hands of any type of police, military, anything like that, we have to ask questions. There is a long path that heads into a very scary place when you start excusing authoritarian measures. And, I'm concerned. We're seeing an uptick in almost the desensitization around ICE and their purpose. And I think we're going to be headed towards the scary grounds in the United States for a while.
Niigaan, who are these ICE agents and what are their qualifications for law enforcement duty?
Well, we don't know because they wear masks, and media, luckily, can do research and find out, but often through nefarious means, backdoor means, through media leaks. The ICE, under Justice Secretary Kristi Noem, has turned into a vigilante force that is intended predominantly to attack blue states for the intentions of bringing forth a kind of shock and awe, a kind of performative way of only dealing with a very small segment of people who are actually the so-called rapists, murderers, killers, drug dealers, which Donald Trump had promised to get rid of. They're actually not really dealing with that issue. What they're doing is they're performing a kind of overt cruelty in front of television cameras on social media to shock and awe blue states into being reminded that Donald Trump's way of governing is, if you are not on my side, you are my enemy. And unfortunately, Indigenous peoples who have actually been at battle with Donald Trump over a long, long period of time, gaming, state laws, sovereignty, going all the way back to the negotiations in the 1980s over casinos, Donald Trump has always treated Indigenous peoples as kind of his enemy, his personal enemy. And so it's no surprise that at the same time that you see ICE really not dealing with the issue of immigration as much as treating people who are oppositional to the politics of Donald Trump badly, that you also see Indigenous peoples being treated terribly badly as well at the same time.
Jennifer, speaking of U.S. President Donald Trump, what is Trump really up to here, turning troops, armed soldiers so often against American citizens?
Oh, I don't want to speculate too much on, on the conspiracy side of where he is headed with this, but history does tell us an important lesson, and that's why it's so important for people to be engaged with what's happening right now and see it for what it really is, because it never starts off at the point that we've read in history books. It's a pathway to get there. And, when you start seeing leaders that think that they don't need democracy and they don't need to listen to citizens and they are supposed to scare the living, bejeebus out of citizens, that's how pathways to things like dictatorships and authoritarian regimes leads to there. And history has reminded us over and over and over again to never let this happen. And yet somehow the political division in both, the United States and somewhat a little bit in Canada is getting to that point now where, they're trying to turn us against our fellow people, and they start by dehumanizing them. And again, pick up a political history book when you want to look at what it looks like for leaders to dehumanize other people. And if we start viewing our fellow mankind like they are not human beings, that is a very, very dangerous place to go. And we are already doing that in the United States. We're not doing it, but we're seeing a leader that is, trying to ingrain into the minds of Americans that these people that are being scooped up by ICE or being targeted by ICE are less than us. They're not to be treated like civilians. They're not to be treated like Americans because they're less than us. And I'm scared. And, we've seen what happens even back in Germany when, this was all going on, where the rounding of big groups of people was happening. And what did that lead to? It led to the Holocaust. And, I'm a very firm believer that we should never compare things to moments in history that deserve their own space of what they actually were. But there's still those pathways that lead to really scary times. And it's really disheartening right now to see how desensitized our fellow human beings are getting. And even in Canada, we're seeing people already praising ICE and praising all of these people. But, during the Freedom Convoy and the Emergencies Act, these were the same people shouting freedom and government overreach and tyranny. But now they're like, well, we just got to let ICE do their jobs down in the US. It's like, what? Yeah, not good.
Yeah, important discussion, and one that definitely needs to continue as well. Well, that's all the time we have for our Truth in Politics panel this week. Jennifer, Niigaan, thank you both so much for joining us.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks.